Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Canada Truth Channel, where Canada, the illusion of freedom and system of control, is exposed. Today is November 11th, 2025. Remembrance Day here in Canada, Veterans Day in the United States. And today we will be honoring the crew of the USS Liberty by bringing you this report. War crimes committed against U.S. military personnel, June 8, 1967. I say we're honoring the crew because this attack by Israel on a virtually unarmed American naval ship in international waters has been covered up by both the U.S. and Israeli governments for 58 years now. 58 years. This report has been covered up for the last 20 years now. This report was filed June 8th, 2005. And the crew and the families of the crew of the USS Liberty have been waiting 58 years for justice and truth. So let's get started. This was submitted to the Secretary of the Army in his capacity as executive agent for the Secretary of Defense, June 8th, 2005. And as we can see, this report is filed by the USS Liberty Veterans Association, Incorporated, a California nonprofit corporation recognized by the Internal Revenue Service as a Section 501c3 tax-exempt veterans organization acting on behalf of the surviving crew members of the USS Liberty. The background. Sorry about that. Here we go. On June 8th, 1967, while patrolling in international waters in the eastern Mediterranean Sea, USS Liberty AGTR-5 was savagely attacked without warning or justification by air and naval forces of the State of Israel. Of the crew of 294 officers and men, including 3 civilians, the ship suffered 34 killed in action and 173 wounded in action. The ship itself, a $40 million state-of-the-art signals intelligence platform, was so badly damaged that it never sailed on an operational mission again and was sold in 1970 for $101,000 as scrap. Israel acknowledged the following facts without qualification. The USS Liberty was an American ship, hence a neutral vis-a-vis the June 1967 war between Israel and its Arab neighbors. The USS Liberty remained in international waters at all times on June 8, 1967. The attacking Israeli forces never made a positive identification of the nationality of the USS Liberty before unleashing deadly force in their attack on the ship. At approximately 0600 hours, all times local, on the morning of June 8, 1967, an Israeli maritime reconnaissance aircraft observer reported seeing a U.S. Navy cargo-type ship just outside the coverage of the Israeli coastal radar defense net, bearing the hull markings GTR-5. This report, made to Israeli Naval HQ, was also forwarded immediately to the Israeli Navy Intelligence Directorate. Throughout this document, they give evidence exhibits. Unfortunately, None of the links to these exhibits are working. I have, however, been able to find most of this information myself, and I will be presenting it in upcoming videos. But for this report, none of these exhibits are available to us. That being said, let's continue. Throughout the remainder of the day prior to the attack, Israeli reconnaissance aircraft regularly flew out to the Liberty's position and orbited the ship before returning to their bases in Israel. A total of no fewer than 8 such flights were made. Approximately 10:50 hours, the naval observer from the early morning reconnaissance flight arrived at Israeli Air Force HQ and sat down with the Air Naval liaison officer there. The two officers consulted Jane's fighting ships and learned that the ship reported earlier in the day was USS Liberty, a United States Navy technical research ship. A United States Navy spy ship is what the Liberty actually was. From 0900 hours on June 8th, 1967, until the time of the attack, 5 hours later, Liberty maintained a speed of approximately 5 knots and a generally westerly-northwesterly course. At 1400 hours, while approximately 17 miles off the Gaza coast, Liberty's crew observed 3 surface radar contacts closing with their position at high speed. A few moments later, the bridge radar crew observed high-speed aircraft passing over the surface returns on the same heading. Within a few short moments and without any warning, Israeli fighter aircraft launched a rocket attack on the Liberty. The aircraft made repeated firing passes, attacking Liberty with rockets and their internal cannons. After the first flight of fighter aircraft had exhausted their ordnance, subsequent flights of Israeli fighter aircraft continued to prosecute the attack with rockets, cannon fire, and napalm. During the air attack, USS Liberty's crew had difficulty contacting Sixth Fleet to request assistance due to the intense communications jamming. The initial targets on the ship were the command bridge, communication antennas, and the 4 50 caliber machine guns placed on the ship to repel boarders. Again, ladies and gentlemen, it was a spy ship. It had 2 50 caliber machine guns fore and 2 50 caliber machine guns aft, and that was it. No other armaments on the ship. It was virtually unarmed in international waters. After the Israeli fighter aircraft completed their attacks, 3 Israeli torpedo boats arrived and began a surface attack about 35 minutes after the start of the air attack. The torpedo boats launched a total of 5 torpedoes, one of which struck the side of USS Liberty opposite the ship's research spaces. 26 Americans, in addition to the 8 who had been killed in the earlier air attacks, were killed as a result of this explosion. So because the Liberty was a spy ship, the crew, the spies on board, were ordered in the event of an attack to destroy everything, right? So nothing would fall into enemy hands. In this case, the enemy was the US's greatest ally in the region, Israel. So they were down below, destroying all of their secret spy shit when the torpedo hit. Following their torpedo attack, the torpedo boats moved up and down the length of the ship, both the port and starboard sides, continuing their attack. raking the ship with cannon and machine gun fire. In Malta, crewmen were later assigned the task of counting all the holes in the ship that were the size of a man's hand or larger. They found a total of 861 such holes, in addition to thousands of 50 caliber machine gun holes. Survivors report that the torpedo boat crews swept the decks of Liberty with continuous machine gun fire, targeting communications equipment and any crew members who ventured above decks. And again, all of the evidence is presented with this report. I'll be covering it in upcoming videos. Damage control firefighters, who had already risked their lives merely by appearing on deck, had to abandon their efforts because their fire hoses had been shredded by machine gun fire. The crew talk about panic because the boat's on fire, and a ship on fire in the middle of the ocean is not a good thing. There's nowhere to run. There's no one to save you. You're on your own. Survivors also report that the torpedo boat crews fired on the inflated lifeboats launched by the crew after the captain gave the order, prepare to abandon ship. This order had to be rescinded because the crew was unable to stand on the main deck without being fired upon, and the life rafts were destroyed as they were launched. The defenseless crew, initially unable to report their plight or summon assistance, and with only themselves to rely upon, fought heroically to save themselves and their ship. In recognition of their effort in this single action, they were ultimately awarded collectively 1 Medal of Honor, 2 Navy Crosses, 11 Silver Stars, 20 Bronze Stars with V for Valor, 9 Navy Commendation Medals, and 204 Purple Hearts. In addition, the ship was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. Now, the members of the Liberty that received these commendations, they were all done in secret, under the threat of court-martial if they talked about what happened June 8th, 1967. Even the Medal of Honor, for the first time, wasn't presented by the President in the White House, but the Secretary of the Navy in a secret ceremony. By patching together different systems, the ship's radio operators had ultimately been able to send a brief distress message that was received and acknowledged by the United States Sixth Fleet Forces present in the Mediterranean. So they finally got the call out. The Sixth Fleet was about 500 miles away. The Saratoga immediately launched fighter aircraft to go protect the Liberty. The USS America had to change out their armaments. Upon receipt of that message, the aircraft carriers Saratoga and America each launched aircraft to come to the aid of the Liberty. Once again, the Saratoga launched first. The America launched after they changed out the armaments. The reported attacking aircraft were declared hostile, and the rescue aircraft were authorized to destroy them upon arrival. The rules of engagement authorizing destruction of the attackers were transmitted to the rescue aircraft in the clear. They were not encrypted. The captain of the Saratoga said in plain English over the airwaves, attack. Defend the USS Liberty. Don't cross out of international airspace. defend yourselves if you're attacked. So they were given full authorization to go in there, defend the Liberty, and kick some ass. Shortly after the Sixth Fleet transmission of the rules of engagement to its dispatched rescue aircraft, the Israeli torpedo boats suddenly broke off their attack and transmitted messages asking if the Liberty required assistance. At the same time, an Israeli naval officer notified U.S. naval attaché at the American embassy in Tel Aviv that Israeli forces had mistakenly attacked a United States Navy ship and apologized. The naval attaché notified the United States Sixth Fleet, and the rescue aircraft were recalled before they arrived at the scene of the attack. Now, the captain of the Saratoga has had some things to say about this, and the Admiral Geiss, I believe his name, was in charge of the Sixth Fleet, and he has different things to say about who actually recalled the American jets. And according to both of them, it was Secretary of Defense McNamara, and then they went over his head and got straight from LGB Lyndon Baines Johnson, the President of the United States, you will recall the aircraft. I don't care what happens to the Liberty. Take that as you will. About the same time as the cessation of the torpedo boat attack, Israeli attack helicopters arrived over the ship. Survivors report that the helicopters were packed with men in combat battle dress. The captain of the USS Liberty gave the order to prepare to repel boarders, but the helicopters departed without attempting to land their troops. Excuse me. What they did do is they dropped a paper bag with a note and an orange in it that says, "Do you have casualties?" And the survivors suspect that the attack helicopters were coming to finish off the rest of the crew. But the Sixth Fleet scrambled jets and they called off all the other attacks, right? The official position of the United States of America concerning these events, as contained in a diplomatic note by Secretary of State Rusk, addressed to the Israeli ambassador, is set forth in relevant part below. And he sent this on June 10th. The Secretary of State presents his compliments to His Excellency, the Ambassador of Israel, and has the honor to refer to the Ambassador's note of June 10th, 1967, concerning the attack by Israeli aircraft and torpedo boats on the United States naval vessel USS Liberty, which was carried out at 16:05 and 16:25 hours local time, respectively, on June 8, 1967, while the USS Liberty was engaged in peaceful activities in international waters. I probably would have not been so pleasant in my opening remarks to that ambassador had I been Secretary of State at the time. Be that as it may. At the time of the attack, the USS Liberty was flying the American flag, and its identification was clearly indicated in large white letters and numerals on its hull. It was broad daylight, and the weather conditions were excellent. Experience demonstrates that both the flag and the identification number of the vessel were readily visible from the air. At 14:50 hours local time on June 8th, 2 Israeli aircraft circled the USS Liberty 3 times with the evident purpose of identifying the vessel. Accordingly, there is every reason to believe that the Liberty was identified, or at least her nationality determined, by Israeli aircraft approximately 1 hour before the attack. In these circumstances, the later military attack by Israeli aircraft on the Liberty is quite literally incomprehensible. As a minimum, the attack must be condemned as an act of military recklessness reflecting wanton disregard for human life. The subsequent attack by Israeli torpedo boats substantially after the vessel was or should have been identified by Israeli military forces manifest the same reckless disregard for human life. The silhouette and conduct of the Liberty readily distinguished it from any vessel that could have been considered as hostile. The Liberty was peacefully engaged, posed no threat whatsoever to the torpedo boats, and obviously carried no armament affording it a combat capability. It could and should have been scrutinized visually at close range before torpedoes were fired. So this is quite a damning memo to the Israeli ambassador. However, the perspective of the U.S. government mysteriously changes. While the ambassador of Israel has informed the Secretary of State that the government of Israel is prepared to make amends for the tragic loss of life and material damage, the Secretary of State wishes to make clear that the United States government expects the government of Israel also to take the disciplinary measures which international law requires in the event of wrongful conduct by the military personnel of a state. He wishes also to make clear that the United States government expects the government of Israel to issue instructions necessary to ensure that the United States personnel and property will not again be endangered by the wrongful actions of Israeli military personnel. The United States government expects that the government of Israel will provide compensation in accordance with international law to the extent that it is possible to compensate for the losses sustained in this tragic event. The Department of State will, in the near future, present to the government of Israel a full monetary statement of its claim. In these circumstances, the latter military attack by Israeli aircraft on Liberty is quite literally incomprehensible. As a minimum, the attack must be condemned as an act of military recklessness, reflecting wanton disregard for human life. And it goes on to repeat the same statement. And since there has been no statement in the last 38 years by the United States government reversing or amending this formal position. The Israeli Defense Forces chief military prosecutor, immediately following the attack, filed formal charges recommending court-martial proceedings against a number of Israeli military personnel. So even the military prosecutor, right after the attack, recognized, holy shit, we just attacked the Americans in international water. We have to conduct court-martials. However, prior to the start of court-martial proceedings, the IDF turned the matter over to an examining judge to confirm that the prosecution should go forward. The examining judge disagreed with the United States' position that the attack was an act of military recklessness, reflecting wanton disregard for human life, and announced in his finding that, "Yet I have not discovered any deviation from standard or of reasonable conduct which would justify the committal of anyone for trial. As a result of this blanket absolution, no one in the Israeli government or military has received so much as a reprimand for their involvement in the attack, much less the punishment demanded by the United States." Within 24 hours of the attack, the United States Navy convened a formal court of inquiry into that attack, a standard investigative procedure reserved for such serious events or circumstances. This procedure was unusual in only one respect. The President and members appointed to the Court of Inquiry by the Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Naval Forces Europe, headquartered in London, were directed orally by the appointing authority to conduct and complete their investigative proceedings within 1 week. A most unusual requirement in light of the nature and magnitude of the events they were ordered to investigate. 34 murdered American sailors and 173 wounded American sailors. Convening initially in London, the court proceeded immediately to the Mediterranean and conducted its inquiry both aboard Liberty as she limped under escort to Malta, and in succeeding days as she lay in dry dock there. Concluding their inquiries there, the President of the Court, with the Navy Judge Advocate General Corps officer who had been appointed as counsel to the court, and with a Navy court reporter who had been assigned from the London headquarters to assist, returned to London on June 16th, 8 days after the attack, with their results. At London, the Navy court reporter supervised the final production of a written record of the court's proceedings and findings, a document of over 600 typewritten pages in length. On the afternoon of June 17, 1967, that record of the court's proceedings was delivered to the senior Navy Judge Advocate General Corps officer, staff for his review and recommendation to the appointing authority concerning his required endorsement and action upon the court's proceedings and record. The staff judge advocate, thus charged with that review, in full compliance and accord with Navy requirements and practice, turned immediately to his detailed examination and consideration of the record. He continued that process steadily into the early morning hours of June 18, 1967. Then, after a 4-hour rest break, he resumed his review at 6 a.m. on June 18th. In the mid-forenoon of June 18th, an emissary from his commander, the appointing authority, appeared and inquired to the staff judge advocate concerning the status of his review and when it might be expected to be completed. The staff judge advocate advised that he had by then read only about a third of the record, and that there were many clerical and typographical flaws in the record that should be remedied before it was formally forwarded to the high governmental authorities who undoubtedly awaited it. That more importantly, the reviewer had not yet been able to find in the parts of the record he had so far reviewed testimony or other evidence to support some of the court's stated conclusions. and that he could not yet estimate when he could complete his review and recommendations, but was continuing to devote himself solely to that task. The emissary from the appointing authority departed with that information, then returned about 20 minutes later with the message that the appointing authority had directed him to come and get the court's record from the staff judge advocate and bring it back to the appointing authority. The staff judge advocate accordingly surrendered the record to the emissary exactly as he had received it. He was neither then nor later asked for any of his work or opinions so far, and he had no further contact with the Court of Inquiry or its results at any time in his active Navy career. So, as per standard operating procedure and requirements, the report, once it was completed, had to go to independent review and provided recommendations and signed off by the appointee, right? Then the emissary came and took it before the review was completed, and that was the end of it. The records of the Navy Department reveal that the written record of proceedings of the U.S. Naval Court of Inquiry into the Israeli attack upon Liberty was formally submitted by the President of the Court of Inquiry to the appointing authority by a written letter dated June 18, 1967, the very day that the record had been withdrawn by the appointing authority from his staff judge advocate. The written record also reveals that the appointing authority on that same day placed upon that record of the court's proceedings a 5-page first endorsement transmitting that record to the Judge Advocate General of the Navy in Washington as required by the Navy's investigative procedures. So the guy they appointed, they took the report away from him. Then the staff judge advocate wrote a 5-page report and submitted it. Mr. Secretary, it is respectfully submitted that, even based solely upon the facts and circumstances outlined above, the Navy Court of Inquiry into the Israeli attack on USS Liberty, the sole official investigation by the United States government into that attack, was deficient and prejudiced, even at its outset, by the unreasonable haste imposed informally by the appointing authority. In addition, the processing of that court's hasty result was further compromised by its preemptory withdrawal from its initial and prescribed legal review in the field and its hurried transmission to the seat of the U.S. government under cover of a purported official endorsement that could not conceivably have been based upon even a cursory complete review of even the hasty work of the Court of Inquiry. Inexplicably, the court record was classified top secret and withheld from public scrutiny for many years. Big surprise there. The cover-up at this point is well underway. In addition to all of that, however, the Judge Advocate General Corps officer who is appointed to serve as counsel to the Navy Court of Inquiry, the officer charged with certifying the authenticity of the court's record, has examined a copy of the record of that Court of Inquiry that has since been released by the government under the Freedom of Information Act and has pronounced it a fraud, and not the record that he had certified and submitted. Furthermore, the president of the Court of Inquiry, following his departure from London with the record on June 8, 1967, his personal delivery of a record to officials in Washington, and his return to his regular duty post in Italy, informed the officer who had served as counsel to the court of inquiry that the court's record of its proceedings had been altered in his presence by civilian government attorneys following its submission. The cover-up continues. Gotta get the non-military government-appointed lawyers to fix up that report so Israel doesn't fucking look bad. The Central Intelligence Agency issued an interim report on the attack dated June 13, 1967, 5 days after the attack and 5 days before the apparent completion of the Navy's abbreviated Court of Inquiry. The heavily redacted copy of the CIA's report that has been released to the public does not state a conclusion, but suggests, based on the information available as of the date of the report, the Israeli forces may not have known they were attacking an American ship. The cover-up continues by the CIA. I have a copy of that CIA report from June 13th, 1967, unredacted, and it basically says, we can't blame the Israelis. They thought it was an Egyptian ship. Bullshit. They knew it was an American ship from 6 a.m., from even before 6 a.m. Writing in his memoirs, Richard Helms, the director of Central Intelligence at the time of the attack, explained that the Central Intelligence Agency undertook a final investigation after more evidence became available. He offered the following information concerning the CIA's final finding. So this is after everything's all said and done, everything's settled, everything's buried, everything's hidden. Now the CIA comes out with this other report stating Israeli authorities subsequently apologized for the incident, but few in Washington could believe that the ship had not been identified as an American naval vessel. Later, an interim intelligence memorandum concluded the attack was a mistake and not made in malice against the U.S. I had no role in the board of inquiry that followed, or the board's findings that there could be no doubt that the Israelis knew exactly what they were doing in attacking the Liberty. I have yet to understand why it was felt necessary to attack this ship or who ordered the attack. Emphasis added. Director Helms was not the only administration official who remained convinced the attack was deliberate. In 1990, in his memoirs, Secretary of State Rusk observed, so all of these guys are making these observations and admissions long after they're out of office, long after this attack has been covered up. And then when they're questioned or writing their memoirs, they say things like, but I was never satisfied with the Israeli explanation. Their sustained attack to disable and sink Liberty precluded an assault by accident on some trigger-happy local commander. Through diplomatic channels, we refused to accept their explanations. I didn't believe them then, and I don't believe them to this day. The attack was outrageous. Yet, all of these people in the administration turned a blind eye and followed the official narrative like good little administrative minions. Similarly, Clark M. Clifford, counsel to the president at the time of the attack, recalled, I do not know to this day at what level the attack on the Liberty was authorized, and I think it's unlikely that the full truth will ever come out. Having been for so long a staunch staunch supporter of Israel, I was particularly troubled by this incident. I could not bring myself to believe that such an action could have been authorized by Levi Eshkol. Yet somewhere inside the Israeli government, somewhere along the chain of command, something had gone terribly wrong and then had been covered up. I never felt the Israelis made adequate restitution or explanation for their actions. So long after they're out of office, they start to tell the truth. The then General Counsel for the Department of Defense, Attorney Paul C. Warnke, opined, "I found it hard to believe that it was in fact an honest mistake on the part of the Israeli Air Force units. I still find it impossible to believe that it was. I suspect that in the heat of battle they figured that the presence of an American ship was inimical to their interests and that somebody without authorization attacked it." The executive branch of the United States government undertook no further review of the attack. Similarly, the United States Congress has never investigated the attack, making it the only attack on a U.S. Navy ship involving significant loss of life that has not been so investigated. Gee, I wonder why Congress refused to investigate this incident. Compounding the harm done to the survivors was the task given to them to bring all human remains and classified materials out of the research spaces that had been destroyed by the torpedo explosion. The survivors assigned to this task were further traumatized by having to secure the remains of their shipmates, men they knew and had lived and worked with. So those guys that had to clean up the mess testify that they had to put the remains of their shipmates, their friends, and all their secret spy shit in fucking garbage bags. That's how they cleaned up. That's how much the U.S. government cared about the 34 Americans murdered in this attack. They fucking cleaned them up in garbage bags and burned them. And once again, ladies and gentlemen, none of the crew members or none of the people speaking out against this attack have anything to gain by doing this. They have everything to lose and nothing to gain. Why would they lie? Well, we'll find out what happens to them later on in this report. In the years that followed the attack, almost all of the evidence pertaining to the attack remained inexplicably highly classified. Starting in the late 70s, redacted documents began to be released as a result of FOIA requests. To this day, many USS Liberty related documents, including the CIA report referenced by Director Helms, remains classified. Once again, we'll be reviewing that report in upcoming videos. A number of individuals and groups, some directly in the employ of the Israeli government, others self-appointed, have attempted to convince the public that the attack on the USS Liberty was but an innocent mistake. In furtherance of this goal, they have fabricated and repeated demonstrably false allegations. The most notable fabrication being that there have been 13 official investigations, including 5 congressional investigations, all of which concluded the attack was a tragic error. There was one investigation by the U.S., Congress never investigated, and That is an absolute lie. These allegations are wholly and demonstrably false. Worse, in some instances, deliberately falsified evidence has been proffered in support of this argument. As a result of the public relations campaign undertaken on behalf of Israel, the USS Liberty survivors have been vilified for their assertions that the attack was deliberate and for their ongoing quest for justice. They are characterized as neo-Nazis, anti-Semites, and conspiracy theorists for wanting nothing more than an honest, open investigation of the attack on their ship and themselves. Just like continuing today, any scrutiny or questioning of Israel and you're automatically a fucking Nazi, an anti-Semite, and a conspiracy theorist. 58 fucking years later, this continues. Sorry for my foul language, but this makes me crazy. And if you read some of the shit that these propagandists have written in books and given interviews on, it is just unbelievable. And this slander has a life given to it by anti-Israel conspiracy theorists who, like the JFK assassination, will never accept the facts in the case. They're all conspiracy theorists. They won't accept the official narrative, which we all know is bullshit, with JFK and with the USS Liberty and many, many, many other things. The Gulf of Tonkin, Pearl Harbor, you name it. But you can't question Israel, the chosen people. Otherwise, you're an anti-Semite, a Nazi, and a conspiracy theorist. That's where we are still 58 years later. I'm going to take a sip of coffee and calm myself down so we can continue. Once again, these people have nothing to gain and everything to lose by publishing this report. Not this overall report. This is another independent report we're going to discuss. In 2003, an independent commission of highly regarded experts was created to look into this matter. This commission wasn't appointed by the government. This was a private commission. The commission consisted of Admiral Thomas H. Moore, United States Navy, former chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Raymond G. Davis, United States Marine Corps, former Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps, Rear Admiral Merlin Starring, United States Navy, former Judge Advocate General of the Navy, and Ambassador James Atkins, former United States Ambassador to Saudi Arabia. The Moore Commission, chaired by Admiral Moore, investigated the attack and made the following findings. We, the undersigned, having undertaken an independent investigation of Israel's attack on USS Liberty, including eyewitness testimony from surviving crew members, a review of naval and other official records, an examination of official statements by the Israeli and American governments, a study of the conclusions of all previous official inquiries, and a consideration of important new evidence and recent statements from individuals having direct knowledge of the attack or the cover-up, hereby find the following. Excuse me. Now, a lot of the surviving crew members were initially interviewed, but their statements were never put into the official report because it contradicts the official narrative that this was just a big mistake, just a horrible accident due to the fog of war. Number one, that on June 8th, 1967, after 8 hours of aerial surveillance, Israel launched a 2-hour air and naval attack against USS Liberty, the world's most sophisticated intelligence ship, inflicting 34 dead and 173 wounded American service members, a casualty rate of 70% in a crew of 294. 70% of the crew was dead or wounded, but it's just a mistake. It's just a mistake. The Israeli military is sorry. Number two, that the Israeli air attack lasted approximately 25 minutes, during which time unmarked Israeli aircraft dropped napalm canisters on the USS Liberty's bridge and fired 30-millimeter cannons and rockets into our ship, causing 821 holes, more than 100 of which were rocket-sized. Survivors estimate 30 or more sorties were flown over the ship by a minimum of 12 attacking Israeli planes, which were jamming all 5 American emergency radio channels. Once again, jamming emergency radio channels is a war crime. Number 3, that the torpedo boat attack involved not only the firing of torpedoes, but the machine gunning of Liberty's firefighters and stretcher bearers as they struggled to save their ship and crew. The Israeli torpedo boats later returned to machine gun at close range 3 of the Liberty's life rafts that had been lowered into the water by survivors to rescue the most seriously wounded. That there is compelling evidence that Israel's attack was a deliberate attempt to destroy an American ship and kill her entire crew. Evidence of such intent is supported by statements from Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Undersecretary of State George Ball, former CIA Director Richard Helms, former NSA Directors Lieutenant General William Odom, Admiral Bobby Ray Inman, and Marshall Carter, former NSA Deputy Directors Olive Kirby and Major General John Morrison, USAF retired, and former Ambassador Dwight Porter, U.S. Ambassador to Lebanon, 1967. Number 5, that in attacking USS Liberty, Israel committed acts of murder against American servicemen and an act of war against the United States. That is an undeniable fact. They murdered 34 American Navy crew members and wounded 173 in sustained attacks from air and sea. That fearing conflict with Israel, the White House deliberately prevented the U.S. Navy from coming to the defense of USS Liberty by recalling 6th Fleet military rescue support while the ship was under attack. Evidence of the recall of rescue aircraft is supported by statements of Captain Joe Tully, commanding officer of the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga, and Rear Admiral Lawrence Geis, the 6th Fleet Carrier Division commander at the time of the attack. Never before in American naval history has a rescue mission been canceled where an American ship was under attack. That although Liberty was saved from almost certain destruction through the heroic efforts of the ship's captain, William L. McGonigal, and his brave crew, surviving crew members, were later threatened with court-martial, imprisonment, or worse if they exposed the truth, and were abandoned by their own government. Still, to this day, 58 years later. That due to the influence of Israel's powerful supporters in the United States, the White House deliberately covered up the facts of this attack from the American people and continue to do so 58 years later. That due to continuing pressure by the pro-Israel lobby in the United States, this attack remains the only serious naval incident that has never been thoroughly investigated by Congress. To this day, no surviving crew member has been permitted to officially and publicly testify about the attack. Well, we know why Congress has never investigated, because they're owned by the Israel lobby. That information has come out. I do not recall off the top of my head what percentage of Congress gets AIPAC money, but it's over 70%. Number 10, that there has been an official cover-up without precedent in American naval history. The existence of such a cover-up is now supported by statements of Rear Admiral Merlin Starring, former Judge Advocate General to the Navy, and Captain Ward Boston, USN, retired the Chief Counsel to the Navy's 1967 Court of Inquiry of Liberty's attack. Number 11, that the truth about Israel's attack and subsequent White House cover-up continues to be officially concealed from the American people to the present day and is a national disgrace. To the present day, meaning November 11th, 2025, and it is absolutely a national disgrace. And many of the USS Liberty crew survivors have now gone to their grave knowing that the American government abandoned them for money from Israel. Their families live with that fact every day. 58 years later. It's absolutely disgusting. Number 12, that a danger to our national security exists whenever our elected officials are willing to subordinate American interests to those of any foreign nation, and specifically are unwilling to challenge Israel's interests when they conflict with the American interests. This policy, evidenced by the failure to defend USS Liberty and the subsequent official cover-up of the Israeli attack, endangers the safety of Americans and the security of the United States. Whereupon, we the undersigned, in order to fulfill our duty to the brave crew of the USS Liberty and to all Americans who are asked to serve in our armed forces, hereby call upon the Department of the Navy, the Congress of the United States, and the American people to immediately take the following actions. First, that a new court of inquiry be convened by the Department of Navy, operating with congressional oversight, to take public testimony from surviving crew members and to thoroughly investigate the circumstances of the attack on the USS Liberty with full cooperation from the National Security Agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the Military Intelligence Services, and to determine Israel's possible motive in launching said attack on a U.S. naval vessel. Second, that every appropriate committee of the Congress of the United States investigate the actions of the White House and Defense Department that prevented the rescue of the USS Liberty, thereafter threatened her surviving officers and men if they exposed the truth, and covered up the true circumstances of the attack from the American people. And third, that the 8th day of June on every year be proclaimed to be hereafter known as the USS Liberty Remembrance Day, in order to commemorate USS Liberty's heroic crew and to educate the American people of the danger of our national security inherent in any passionate attachment of our elected officials for any foreign nation. We, the undersigned, hereby affix our hands and seals this 22nd day of October 2003. Again, ladies and gentlemen, these are friggin' heavy hitters. These are friggin' heavy hitters that finally say enough is enough, the truth needs to come out. The Federal Criminal Code makes special provision for the prosecution of war crimes, whether inside or outside of the United States, committed against the United States Armed Forces personnel. And it lists the offenses. It goes on to also list the Geneva Convention listed war crimes. And 58 years later, here we are, a guy in Canada from his garage talking about this report that's 20 years old now, that has been once again buried by the US and Israeli governments. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's up to us to share this information and honor the crew of the USS Liberty and their families by bringing the truth out. Finally, 58 years later, we owe it to them. In the instant matter, Israeli freely acknowledged that the USS Liberty was a neutral ship in international waters. Israel also admitted that the attack was deliberate and made with the intent, to sink the ship and crew. Israel has thus explicitly admitted the essential elements of a violation of Article 1 of the Hague Convention on Naval Warfare. Israel has further admitted the essential elements required to establish a grave breach, as that term is defined in the Geneva Convention of 1949. The Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal established certain principles that were later adopted by all members of the United Nations. And it goes on to list those as well. And it gives examples of the same type of actions being found to be war crimes. Accordingly, it is established prima facie that Israel was guilty of the commission of the war crime of attacking a neutral vessel in neutral waters as a consequence of its attack on USS Liberty. USS Liberty survivors, through sworn statements, have established that the Israeli torpedo boats shot at rescuers and firefighters on the deck of the ship. They have further established that the same torpedo boats shot at Liberty's life rafts after the rafts had been put over the side of the ship into the sea for use by shipwrecked survivors. There also exists prima facie evidence that Israeli forces committed additional separate war crimes by firing on the wounded and their rescuers, as well as subsequently firing into the life rafts. The concerns of an Israeli whitewash first articulated by Secretary of State Rusk and later echoed by Undersecretary State Battle, turned out to be prophetic. In direct violation of Article 52 of the Geneva Conventions, the Israeli Defense Forces absolved themselves of any wrongdoing, including criminal negligence, involving their attack on USS Liberty. When provided with a copy of the Israeli report, NSA Deputy Director Louis Tordella wrote, "A nice whitewash for a group of ignorant, stupid, and inept," redacted on the cover of his copy. He wrote, "A nice whitewash for a group of ignorant, stupid, and inept," derogatory term on his copy of the report. In that Israel has abdicated its responsibility under international law to investigate and bring the wrongdoers to justice, the task falls to the government of the aggrieved parties to act on their behalf. Conclusion. The USS Liberty Veterans Association has established prima facie the commission of war crimes by the State of Israel against U.S. military personnel and civilians. These Americans volunteered to serve their country. They followed all orders given to them. In the course of following those orders, they were suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the State of Israel, and their own country did absolutely nothing to protect them or seek justice on their behalf. The failure of the United States government to undertake a complete investigation of the Israeli attack on USS Liberty has resulted in grievous harm to the surviving victim, as well as to the families of all crew members. Equally serious, this failure has resulted in an indelible stain upon the honor of the United States of America. It has sent a signal to America's serving men and women that their welfare is always subordinate to the interests of a foreign state. The only conceivable reason for this failure is the political decision to put the interests of Israel ahead of those American servicemen, employees, and veterans. Finally, the fact that the Israeli government and its surrogates in the United States have worked so long and hard to prevent an inquiry itself speaks volumes as to what such an inquiry would find. The USS Liberty Veterans Association Incorporated respectfully insists that the Secretary of the Army convene an investigatory body to undertake the complete investigation that should have been carried out 38 years ago. No, it's now 58 years ago. When will the justice for the crew of the USS Liberty and their families see the light of day? As always, ladies and gentlemen, please use the links I provide and read this entire report for yourself and share it with other people. This has been covered up for 58 years, and it's time that the American people especially, but the people of the world, know that this happened and it's been covered up by the American government and the Israeli government for 58 years. Let's honor these veterans on this Remembrance Day, on this Veterans Day, by sharing this information. Please stay tuned for more videos on the USS Liberty. A lot of the evidentiary articles presented in this report, I have the actual documents, and I'm going to be doing several more videos on the Liberty, but wanted to get this one out on Remembrance Day, Veterans Day. So let's honor them and share this information. Thanks for watching.